And so Jan, though, currently for another couple months or so is the director of the University College London School of Slavonic and East European Studies, where he's also a professor of Slavonic East European Studies and vice provost for Europe at UCL. He's had an incredible career spanning disciplines. His PhD is actually in anthropology, interestingly, and of course building connections between anthropology and anthropological methods and political science. Some of his most famous books, for instance, the Power of Symbols Against the Symbols of Power, about the Solidarity movement in Poland, Anthropology and Political Science with another former colleague, Mike Aronoff, and he's done extensive work on protest and civil society mobilization in Eastern Europe, including a long-term collaboration with Grzegorz Eckert from Harvard. So I'm going to pass things over to the able hands of my colleague Jan, who will then take it from here and handle the rest of the panel. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you so much. I'm speaking through tears of joy, I suppose. But thank you for this introduction. This is a panel when you think about it in terms of what are the important works in your life, and I have a shelf of important works. I do not know, the nature of the work together between George and John. And John, I do not unfortunately know enough about you because there's nothing here on this. So
oh my goodness! Sorry, John.
I'm sorry about it.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure you will be on that bookshelf also very soon, or maybe you should be there. But anyway, that's the working
His
shelf.
book is called Why Americans Hate the Media. It should be on your bookshelf.
So it is the book of what I call the living classics. Okay. So this is really a great honor to chair the panel of that is composed of the people whose books are sitting on that shelf. So there are a few of them, but I will mention only one book per person, and you have more extensive bios. You can read more about each of them. So Bob Kaufman's The Political Economy of Democratic Transitions, of all the books, I think is so important because I keep coming back to it, and maybe many of us. Then Lucan Wei's book with Steve Levitsky, which was already mentioned here and discussed extensively in a way for a 1-hour panel or so. Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War. It was one of the most enjoyable reviews I have ever written.
Enjoyable to read, too.
Thank you. And George Tucker, the Regional Economic Voting, an extremely important book for many of us, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. So this is the all-star panel, like all of them are in a way, and we will go according to the announced schedule. So Bob, why don't you begin? It is 15 minutes, I suppose.
Okay, I'll try. Well, thank you, Jan. Dan, thank you for mentioning me as a co-organizer, but it should be Dan Kellerman in very bold and large letters, and then Bob Kaufman in very small letters. Dan did virtually all of the heavy lifting. So, well, I'm going to talk about a paper that I wrote just fairly recently, which was an attempt to, I'm not sure what it is. It's not exactly a political science paper, and it expands my somewhat builds on my work, but it expands beyond that. And the idea was to try to sort out my thinking about the dangers that Trump poses to democracy in the United States. So the bottom line, I'm going to talk about other cases, but the bottom line is really what these cases imply for the U.S. And, of course, since the election of Trump, there have been a lot of references about the parallels between Trump. We heard some this morning about the references to historical cases, but also a lot of references to experiences with contemporary cases popular autocrats, and you see a lot of questions about whether Trump will become another Chavez or another Putin, or Erdogan or others. And so I decided in this paper to try to take these references seriously and systematically and look as carefully as I could at what I see as the differences and similarities between the United States and what I call middle-income backsliders. By backsliding, and I think we need to kind of make sure we understand, or at least distinguish between that and, systems, democracies that end with coups or with some other fairly dramatic bang. These are incremental attacks on mechanisms of horizontal accountability. I'm sure we've seen those before historically, but they seem to be increasingly common in the contemporary world. And so the questions I ask in the paper is, first of all, what allowed would-be autocrats to get elected in the first place? And then once in office, how were they able to capitalize on what are essentially, in any democracy are going to be temporary electoral majorities? How did they capitalize on those to lock themselves into power, at least increase their opportunities? And so in the first two sections of the paper, I take these questions up in cases I know something about, Venezuela, Russia, Turkey, and Hungary. And then the last section is on the United States, and I try to pull out what I think are the relevant differences and similarities. So I do think, the backsliding cases that I just mentioned are obviously quite different. But there are some family resemblances in a number of ways, and what I try to do in the paper is kind of trace out the factors that I think, common factors that I think are most relevant. So one, and this, I was just talking to Dan during the break, this I think engages to some extent what Dan was talking about in terms of his emphasis on institutions and parties. I see in these cases that's certainly relevant, but I see in these cases also a widespread public perception of dysfunction. This is a mass as well as an elite phenomenon. And very closely related to this, and I know I'll get into trouble for saying this, but I think a key element of this is the economy. A lot of the feeling of disconnect comes from the reality of the fact that these democratic regimes weren't delivering the goods. And this is particularly true, of course, in Venezuela and Russia, where you have prolonged periods of economic crisis, but it's also true at least to some extent, in the other countries. And I think this disconnect is important in turn for understanding the way in which populist leaders can exploit electoral opportunities. And in all of the cases we see, both on the right and the left, populism, people in effect making the argument that the democratic system is bankrupt, appealing to a kind of a large constituency that feels that they're marginalized from the system. There is a difference, and we can talk about it maybe in the discussion, between right-wing populism in Russia, Turkey, and Hungary, and kind of a left-wing populism in Venezuela. But I sort of buy what has become a common argument, at least among Latin Americanists, that populists, right and left, have more in common than there are differences, and they all share a certain kind of themes, claims to represent not only temporary majorities, but the national will, identification of checks and balances as obstacles to the popular will, branding of competitors as enemies rather than as legitimate competitors. And all of this you see in the cases that I've looked at and also in the United States. A third factor I think that's important, a common theme, is that, and here I think this joins with some of the things we heard earlier this morning, that in all of these cases, both the opposition, the established parties are weakened. Sometimes, in some cases, they're not strong to begin with. But in a case like Venezuela, for example, where you have very robust mainstream parties, they fragment under the weight of the popular discontent. And the weakening of the political parties, I would say both left and right, but the weakening of the political parties basically undercuts either both the incentives and the capacity of the opposition to check constitutional majorities that are of the populist rulers. A fourth factor, again common in all of these cases, is an economic recovery, sometimes delayed but significant, that allows the new rulers to claim credit. And this was particularly important, it seems to me, in Venezuela, Russia, Turkey, and of course also furnished resources that were important in consolidating power. And then the final factor that I think is relevant to all of these cases is, once in office, building on these other resources, an increased deployment of economic and coercive resources of the state to lock in control over the main institutions of civil society, the press, the judicial system, and so forth, in a way that tilts the political playing field decisively against the opposition. This has gone farthest in Venezuela and Hungary, but it's also in Venezuela and Russia, but it's also gone there and the other cases as well. How am I doing on time?
6 minutes and 5 seconds.
I don't want the 5 seconds to count against my question. Let me note one issue before I move on, because again, I think it engages to some extent the discussion this morning, and that's whether it's useful and possible to draw a line between these regimes as imperfect democracies that don't function very well but are democratic, and competitive authoritarian regimes or electoral autocracies. And this has been a problem in all of these cases because they slide backward incrementally, and you sort of don't know at what point you want to label them as authoritarian. I looked at the polity scores for Venezuela and Russia, for example. They fall below the 6-point threshold in Venezuela only in 2009, and in Russia only in 2008. So, it's clear that they had gone pretty far in the authoritarian wreck before then, but these weren't picked up, and and you can criticize polity, but I think it's a general issue. And the issue is important. I mean, there's an empirical question, but the issue is also important conceptually, and I'm more concerned with the conceptual question, whether it's useful to kind of struggle to identify a threshold. And I think it is. I think it's important. One of the things that quotes from Adam Przeworski that I always think of is that democracy is the institutionalization of uncertainty. And the implication is that, again, there can be all sorts of abuses, but it implies that the opposition has a real shot of winning, and that if it wins, the incumbents are going to yield power. Now, how you find that in the real world is a hard question to ask, but I don't think it's a question that can be ignored. And it has practical implications, because once a backsliding government has become an electoral autocracy, they're much less likely to cede power peacefully. And maybe Javier will talk about this at some point, but it's clear in Venezuela. They lose, but they use other resources to stay in power. So let me quickly turn to speculation about the chances of backsliding in the United States. And there's some good news here. I mean, I think it would be a mistake to just draw a straight line, a big mistake to draw a straight line between these cases and the United States. One very important difference is that basic constitutional structures in the United States are on much firmer ground than in any of the countries that, in Latin America or Europe. In the other backsliding countries, basically political support for constitutional constraints had disappeared. And so you have these sort of remarkable changes in constitutional structure: the elimination of the Senate, the elimination of term limits, the writing of entirely new constitutions. None of that is very likely in the United States, and I think is an important. I mean, they can be eroded. Clearly, in many respects, they already have been. But I think there are certain kind of basic decision rules that would be hard to alter. Another important difference is that Trump's political support is much more fragile than was the case in a lot of the backsliding countries. He lost the popular vote. He has a majority in Congress, but it's very transactional, very tentative. And the Democrats, even though they've been very weakened, are still a much stronger kind of opposition than you see in these other cases. So that, I think, is important. And then, of course, third, the United States still has an extraordinarily robust civil society, a diverse economy with a lot of independent centers of power that would be quite difficult in the short run to bring under political control. So those are the differences. I think there are also some similarities that should be taken very seriously. And I detail these. Here's some quick sort of headlines. I mean, one is the erosion of trust in political institutions. And Fowle and Monk have documented that. There are other sources of documentation, too. This doesn't mean that democracy in America will collapse, but what it does do is weaken the incentive and the capacity of the political establishment to defend the autonomy of institutional checks. A second factor is the sense of economic decline. The United States has recovered more quickly than Europe from the big financial collapse, but growth has been slower than average. A lot of people have been left out of the recovery, and I think this is also another similarity with some of the backsliding cases that I've looked at. Trump's electoral appeal looks very much like the appeals that brought Erdogan and Orban and Putin to power. I think those, I won't dwell on that, but it seems like that's been amply examined. Battles over the politicization of institutions. This goes far before Trump, but battle over the Supreme Court, attacks on the veracity of the press, attacks on the credibility of the electoral system, which is something more or less new. And although civil society is strong, hard to measure that, I don't think we should overestimate its capacity to act as a check. One thing that I think ought to be taken into account is the concentration of wealth, because this has really, in many ways, tilted the balance toward more conservative political and social organizations. Unions, we don't talk about unions anymore. They're not part of the civil society organization. Civil society organizations depend on funding from the government. Many of them depend on access to courts. All of this is less likely under Trump than it was. And so I don't think, I think civil society is important, but I don't think we should necessarily count on it. Give me 2 more minutes, and I think I can, I don't know how many.
How much are you paying? You are at 1639.
No, 2 more minutes. So I end the paper with 3 scenarios that range from bad to very bad to very, very bad. I don't see any good news in the United States. So the least bad is that Trump will serve out his term and be defeated in 2020, or some successor will be defeated in 2020. And this rests on, I think, 2 assumptions that are not altogether well-founded, but maybe. The first is that that Trump's promises to stimulate stronger growth will quickly be revealed as not being delivered. I think that's a pretty good bet. And if that happens, then, and the sooner it happens, the more isolated Trump is likely to become, not only from the population, but from his own congressional supporters. And the second assumption is that electoral institutions are going to survive the assaults on voter rights, which is not entirely a sure thing. But if those 2 assumptions hold, then they'll, one can expect some kind of normal rotation in office. Doesn't mean that during the 4 years there can't be a lot of damage done to liberal democracy and the political system. It also doesn't mean that a defeat of Trump will end the kind of economic tensions and racial tensions that brought him to power in the first place, but at least it'll offer an opportunity to halt the backsliding. The second scenario is chaos. It sounds a lot like, I wrote this in February, but it sounds like a lot what's going on today. And the initial premise here is the same as the first, which is the Trump bump won't materialize. But the difference is that Trump will just double down on a lot of his radical initiatives. And what this would imply, doesn't mean that what this would imply is that the sort of increasingly fraught confrontations with civil society, the press, the courts, and so forth. These are likely to be constitutional crises, and this is important to note, different from the backsliders, not necessarily a concentration of executive power. And it might end differently than the first scenario with resignation or impeachment rather than electoral defeat, but it's even more than the first scenario likely to exacerbate the tensions and dysfunction of American democracy. And the third scenario is an electoral autocracy. I think this is less likely because there's still so many centers of opposition. And even if we sort of moved in that direction, it's doubtful that Trump could last as long as Chavez or Putin. But it shouldn't be discounted entirely. I think a key variable is whether Trump can deliver quickly on an acceleration of growth. And this was a hugely important in 3 of the cases that I looked at, Venezuela, Russia, and Turkey. And of course, that's not likely to be successful or sustainable in the long term, but it is a factor that can pump up support in the short term, and then give an opportunity for a congressional majority to rally around measures to expand control over the security apparatus or to build allies in the private sector. And at that point, even if the economy fades, it might be too late to challenge Trump through normal constitutional channels or even through impeachment. The demise of competitive authoritarian regimes is likely, if that's where we end up, likely to involve a good deal of turmoil, popular pressure, and mobilization. And I think that extra constitutional efforts to defeat that kind of regime would almost certainly lead to an even deeper legacy of polarization and mutual recrimination.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks. It's really great to be here. Among other things, it's always wonderful to meet people whom you've cited. I never got to know Kaufman, Eric France, Bob Kaufman, of course, Jan Kubik. Whenever I'm depressed, Jan, I keep that review under my pillow. I just take it out like, life is good, man. So today I'm going to talk about, has democracy declined? All of you know lots of reasons for pessimism. I mean, in many ways, the global conditions for democracy are about as bad as they have been in a very long time. Dysfunctional EU, rising right, a very aggressive Russia, as well as a rising China. Basically, we seem to be undergoing a fundamental change in the global balance of power, which would not seem to favor democracy. And of course, this guy. Now, to talk about, so the question is still sort of, has democracy declined? I still actually think it's a question. I don't, despite the large numbers of conferences on this topic, I think it really is a question mark there, and I'll talk about that in great detail in a second. But before we go there, I really want to talk about what we mean by democracy. I think there's an enormous confusion, most of it propagated by Freedom House, which seems to include like everything bad in the, so if you look at their scorings, like their rationale for changing scorings, they say, they use increase in common criminality, they use Cuban advisors. Who knew that Cuban advisors was part of the definition of autocracy? Seriously, it's ridiculous. So I'm just, this is old-fashioned Dalian definition, familiar to everyone. What I do add is a bit of my own spice. Stephen Levitsky and I talk about an even playing field. What do we mean by relatively even playing field? Here we mean basically an uneven playing field is defined as cases in which incumbent abuse makes the opposition have a very hard time getting access to financing, the media, or nonpartisan institutions. And the point about this is that these can often occur without obvious civil liberties violations. In other words, it can occur because the incumbent party packs major private media with their own cronies, right? It can occur because the judges, whenever there are electoral complaints, the opposition's electoral complaints are consistently denied, as in Hungary. In other words, this can occur very much under the radar in ways that don't involve necessarily violations of what you see here. So I think this is a very important point, which I think helps explain some of the confusion around cases like Poland and Hungary today, as well as potentially Venezuela in the early 2000s. Okay, this does not include a lot of stuff that is bad. You can have racist and xenophobic rhetoric, but still have democracy. You can have people who steal everything from the public purse, but that maybe it will often have no impact on suffrage or on the right of the opposition to compete. And perhaps most surprisingly, traditionally, I'm not sure this is right, checks and balances have not been included in the definition of procedural democracy. In fact, Guillermo O'Donnell, he called it delegative democracy, right? This was a democracy, form of democracy where you eliminated checks and balances. I'm a little uncomfortable with the fact that this is not included, but that's it's arguable. Anyways, okay. So this is my definition of democracy. So we've been hearing pessimism. This is what we have. This is Freedom House. Freedom House, the most, who's basically made its career on the last 20 years, 10 years, saying there's democratic decline. This is what we have. Blue. It's like, is that decline?
This is the numbers of.
This is numbers of democracy-free countries. Quality, wow. They're showing a substantial increase. Basically, you get the same. You look at VDAM. You look at Bertelsmann. Basically, it's stability. So what is going on. Now, as many of you know, Steve Levitsky and I wrote a piece about, published about 3 years ago, making the argument that there has not been democratic decline. Basically pointing out that a lot of, in fact, while some democracies have declined, others have risen to replace it. So in the last about 20 years, you've had declines of democracy in Venezuela, Mali, Thailand, and the Philippines, but you've also had, Croatia, Ghana, Mexico, Peru, and Senegal on the other side. So it's basically evened out. Basically, what you have is not a decline, but basically sort of stability, which is very different. And basically, the problem isn't actual economic democratic decline. The problem is unrealistic expectations. Basically, the third wave involved a lot of countries where structurally democracy, was good for democracy, East Central Europe and Latin America. But that led to completely unrealistic expectations that, therefore, democracy would succeed in places where the conditions were not so good, former Soviet Union Africa. So here, the problem is, stupid expectation, unrealistic. Sorry, you're not supposed to be stupid. My 5-year-old would get very angry at me. Bob has been very bad. Unrealistic expectations. Second is, and this is where I a little bit disagree with Bob, I think some of the backsliding, quote-unquote backsliding, has occurred in countries like Turkey, like Russia, that were never really democratic to begin with. I mean, Turkey, it's really a transition very much from one form of authoritarianism to another. I agree that there are good reasons to expect that Turkey should have democratized. Structural conditions are pretty good in Turkey. Nonetheless, I don't think there's much evidence to call it really backsliding. Okay, so then I look at this, I'm like, aha, I don't have to do any work. I can just cut and paste, spend more time with my kids, right? But that wasn't quite right. Because the recent because I think what you had in the past, backsliding has primarily occurred in countries where you would never expect democracy to work in the first place. The fact that democracy didn't survive in Mali, too bad for Malians, but not a huge surprise. But what you've had recently is breakdown of democracy in countries that everyone would expect democracy to survive. And this is the problem. Is that it's a question of quality, not quantity, right? So net, it's the same, but Hungary is gone and it's been replaced by lower middle income countries like Tunisia, Ukraine, Albania, Pakistan, which there is. My wife, her family is from Pakistan. I'm sorry, father-in-law, I'm not going to put a lot of money on the survival of democracy in Pakistan. Don't touch. And furthermore, you've seen a really stunning impact of the election of Trump. I don't think it's accidental that since the beginning of 2017, you've had in Venezuela, Hungary, and the Philippines, quite significant violations of democracy. That I think, because people feel like it's like the border guard. It's like, oh man, this is like, it's our time. We can party down, do whatever we want. We can let our autocratic inclinations free, right? I expect this to continue. And I think that that's why I think it's important to focus on the breakdowns of these established democracies, and that there are lessons. The first is that a lot of the backsliding, this is obviously not the case in Venezuela recently, but has occurred on a much more subtle level, basically in the realm of checks and balances, and importantly in the realm of the level playing field, right? And so, Hungary, until their attempt to close down the CEU, has done violations that are genuinely confusing. Polity and Freedom House, both in 2016, call Hungary a free or democratic country. And I think it's because they should have read our, Christ. How do you do this? I did everything wrong. Okay, good. They should have looked at the uneven playing field. Hungary is a classic example of an uneven playing field. There is At this point, there are no opposition national radio stations. The Hungarian government monopolizes the public media, and Fidesz cronies dominate most of the private media. So I think that it's clearly a competitive authoritarian regime, but more in the spirit of Botswana, right? Going the Diamond thing, which is we convinced Larry Diamond to call Botswana competitive authoritarianism, and lo and behold, then the Freedom House changed their score, so you have enormous power over Botswana. So so if you're Botswana, I'm sorry. Okay, but the second issue, and this is, I think, interesting that hasn't been mentioned, at least explicitly, is the impact of polarization. That if you look at Hungary, Poland, certainly Venezuela, what has preceded the breakdown of democracy, basically, I think perhaps in all cases where established democracy is broken down, you see significant polarization. In the case of Hungary, I mean, it's a kind of interesting case because in the 1990s, Hungary wasn't at all especially polarized. It was really Orbán who sort of made this very conscious decision to move to the far right, and he polarized politics to the extent that I was talking with the Hungarian consul a few days ago in Toronto, and she was saying by the mid-2000s, support for Fidesz was basically breaking up families. That Fidesz supporters considered non-support for their party that meant that you were anti-Hungarian, right? And then suddenly there emerged this sort of very American-style polarization of people who support religion and government versus people who support secularism. And this divide, I think, to an important extent, is not the only factor that created, obviously, autocracy in Hungary, but sort of raised the stakes, contributed to this discourse where opposition was equated with criminality, right? And in which, to be in opposition to Fidesz was basically to be treasonous. And if you read a lot of this stuff, which I read recently, Steve Bannon, where did he get these ideas about the deep state? From the Hungarians, right? I was reading, 2013, a Fidesz parliamentarian talking about sort of justifying the basic politicization of the Hungarian state by the fact that the quote-unquote deep state was controlled by the nomenklatura, which was a foreign force. So authoritarianism is necessary, basically, to get rid of foreign control over Hungary. That's interesting. And I think more broadly, while the specifics of each case are different, I think we really need to pay attention to polarization, which I think means interesting with Dan, because I think Dan is a black, because I think, in some ways, polarization both precedes, but also, is fueled by this sort of institutional breakdown. The sort of relationship between the two is quite interesting and complicated. I mean, I would say in the American case that the movement conservatives came long before before the breakdown of the public party. So at least chronologically, it would seem that polarization should take first prize in the causal Game of Thrones. And that is it. I'm done, man. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, here. Okay. Everything's going to be bad. Sorry, I didn't give a conclusion. Basically, the point is we have mixed evidence of backsliding. It's not obvious. There's still, that question mark deserves to be there, man. But the clouds are clearly looking bad. Don't fly in that weather, especially not with United. Yeah. So there we go. Okay. Great. You guys have. Yeah. Oh, here you go.
They have slides. They have slides.
It's on the desktop.
Oh,
It's right there.
no, the slides are right there. Yeah, okay. We were just trying to get a quick one.
Oh.
Okay, great. All right. Why are we not on the screen?
Except it's not on the screen.
do you have notes on this? Or
Nope.
do you, okay, so what we just want to do is,
Awesome. Okay, great. All right. Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks, Dan, for organizing this. When Dan invited me to participate in the conference, there were a bunch of different things that I was working on that I think would have fit in really nicely here, and I'm happy to talk to you about them more during breaks and question and answer. We have some work on support for far-right ideology throughout all of Europe and looking at whether or not that changed, whether the economic determinants of support for far-right ideology changed during before and after the Great Recession. The bottom line of that is it didn't, so I'm happy to talk about more on that later. Also some work on the rise of online hate speech on Twitter during the U.S. 2016 presidential elections. The bottom line on that is it didn't either. But we're going to take a break and actually try to take advantage of the fact that we have so many good people here in a room, try to get you guys to help us a little bit, but maybe help yourselves by doing that, which is we're going to talk about something that I thought would be a total detour from what was being done before, but actually follows very nicely from previous presentations that have talked about Freedom House and polity data. And we're going to talk about measuring democratic quality in the United States, new tools and data collection. But just before we do that, since Dan Ziblatt did this, I'm going to mention I have a book coming out this week too. And he said, yeah, communism. Yeah, some of you have been commenting on this book for like 8 to 10 years. So, but it is coming out. It's available. Grigo has a hard copy, has an actual copy of it. I haven't seen the print copy. May 11th is the release date, and we said we just wanted it priced less than Dan's book, so it's available for $29.99 on Amazon. So you could buy it. You can buy it now. Pre-order it. It'll be downloaded onto your Kindle automatically while you sleep the night of May 9th. Okay, so not that that's not sort of creepy. But anyway. Okay, so what we're going to talk to you about today is that John and I were involved in a conversation that took place earlier this year at the Knight Foundation. Obviously, a lot of people talking about this question of democracy and breakdown. And what the Knight Foundation wanted to be able to do when they brought a bunch of people together is they wanted to be able to do a better job as program officers, sponsoring grants, giving money to people, if what they wanted to do was sort of strengthen democracy in the United States. And they wanted sort of tools, availability. They wanted to be able to, how could they help essentially program officers who wanted to know how to spend money in strengthening democracy in the United States. So they wanted to be able to better inform their grant-making procedures. So this is actually a unit of Knight that is devoted to their own kind of internal evaluation that brought together this conference. And one of the things, they had a lot of people sitting around the conference, and the think tank people said, oh, we should have more meetings with inspiring speakers. And the academics said, oh, you should go get more data. And so it was a kind of a sort of weird conversation. But one of the things that came out of it was that to start this process, it was important to kind of know what was out there already. So they came and they sort of commissioned us to write an essay that would sort of look at what was out there, but also make some suggestions about what Knight could do in improving data related to the sort of strength of democracy. And their particular issue is the strength of democracy in the United States. So what could the foundation fund going forward? And so they sort of commissioned us to give them the information for this. So what we are doing in this report that we're writing for them, that we're submitting at the end of this month, is both giving them a sort of broad-based review of what's out there, but then also making some recommendations about what to do next. So what we're going to do in this talk, so our report basically goes through cross-national measures of democracy that people have been talking about today, assesses strengths, weaknesses, and usage. Then we look at U.S. measures of democracy, strengths, weaknesses, and usage, and then we have some ideas for what Knight could do. We make some proposals to them about new tools for access to this data, new data collections, and forms of outreach. What we're going to talk to you about today is we're going to give you a sort of super brief overview of what we've learned about from this cross-national and U.S. existing measures. And then we're going to tell you the proposals that we're thinking of making, planning on making in this report, and we'd love to get your feedback on this. And that can be done in the context of this conversation today. You can also email us afterwards if you have ideas and ideas here. So, and we're going to kind of go back and forth because I was handling the cross-national stuff and John was handling the U.S. stuff. So, super brief, right? This is a huge lit review. We looked at tons and tons of stuff to get to this point. But basically, existing cross-national data sets have the following characteristics to them. Primarily, not exclusively, primarily they are aimed at generating a quantitative measure, so that Lucan can plot it on a chart here today that we showed. And in general, what they produce is one score per country per year. Now, sometimes that score for democracy is disaggregated into different components, like Freedom House has 2 components, other scores have more than 2 components.
But rarely is it ever disaggregated at more than the year level. And rarely is it ever disaggregated, if ever, at more than the country level. So basically what you are getting is one measure for every year for every country. And this is across the board. Then the interesting thing when you look at all these different data sets is that they, with one exception, for the most part, they are all engaging in some variety of expert coding. So expert coding can be, we're the Economist Intelligence Unit, we hire some guy to write this report up for us, or we're the State Department, we have our person who's in charge of this particular country write a report for us. Expert coding can then go to the sort of much grander, we have a bunch of people collaborating to write a report up, we have a bunch of people we're surveying to ask them about what they think their scores are, to even larger expert efforts like the new VDEM project, which is getting 2,500 experts around the world lining up lots of people per country. But pretty much that's what they're all doing, some sort of variation on expert coding. People like you are being asked for your assessments. And then there's variation in how many experts. There's variation in how we go from each individual expert assessment to what the overall metric is. And we'll talk about this when we get to best practices at the end. And there's very large levels of variation about how public the process by which this happens. But at the end of the day, we have lots of different measures. And one of the things we do in the report is we go through and we show there really are like a dozen of these things out there that do these types of different things, and we can break them down into different criteria, different characteristics, but where they get their experts for, how they kind of do it. So all these different reports are covered all these different things are covered in the report, in which we go through sort of a bit of a description of the measure. We talk about some of the literature that has been used and what things people have done with these things. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to John to talk about the U.S. democracy. We're going to kind of go back and forth there.
So one of the things we realized is that the measures that are international, basically the comparative politics measures of democracy, are quite different than what's available in the United States exclusively, and mainly because to evaluate democracy in the United States, which is what Knight's main goal, you can make comparisons with other countries, or you can make comparisons of the United States with its past over time, or you could do both at once. Or you could finally make comparisons across regions of the United States. And the thing that does, methods that are chosen in the U.S. that do the latter two, U.S. over time, U.S. across regions, are very different than the comparative measures. There are very few that are widely used by Americanists that are these expert surveys. Instead, we have and generally, Americanist scholars don't generally take the stability of democracy as somewhat of a given. There are some exceptions to this, and Rob Mickey, who's not here today, but he was the great exception in terms of his book is great in talking about the Jim Crow South and it's just an example of authoritarianism and engaging with the authoritarianism literature. It's a really deep and large qualitative historical book, but that's kind of the exceptions. So we wanted to look at measures that could make comparisons over time and across regions. These measures are not primarily designed for that purpose, and to some degree, all the research in American politics can be considered in some way assessing democracy. So one is zero in on things that could be classified, they're not often used this way because Americanists don't often speak this way, even though they probably should, to evaluate the stability and the state of American democracy as a whole. So what existing measures could be used for this. So here's a list. You could use some types of questions from the American National Election Study, the General Social Survey. Gallup is a confidence institutions time series. That's a little hard to get. You have to assemble it yourself from the Roper Archive. They don't really easy to get, but it's available. Pew has basically a second hand that they have accumulated from other sources of confidence institutions. A lot of people use in this way the congressional roll call summaries called Nominate as a measure of polarization, as a way of talking about democracy, democratic stability. They're measures of this at the state level, state legislative measure of polarization, and then simply turnout. A lot of people do assess American democracy in their books as well. They should measure turnout. A lot of these are surveys, so these may be survey measures or roll call measures, very not expert surveys. And there's one that's I included but is not widely known, but I discovered in this project, which is Richard Cole and John Kincaid had this time series in 1974 of trust in federal government versus state and local government, which is not widely cited and not widely used, but is a fascinating idea. So just to give you a brief sense of how, so the measure you might use would matter. I mean, when Americans do talk about the health of U.S. democracy overall, they might use the American National Elections Committee's trust in government measure. And you can see this is percentage of Americans who say they trust the government most of the time from 1958 through, this goes to 2012. I didn't incorporate the 2016 NES yet. You see variation, but you do see the end is lower than the beginning, to say the obvious, despite variation. But the NES has a variety of other measures, such as in their efficacy scores. So it asks the government officials how many are crooked, and as the percentage say quite a few, which is the highest category since 1958, and it's steadily. So the story is not simple, but the end is higher than the beginning. We go up to about 60%, over 60% from the mid-20s. The NES has also asked things like, do you agree that public officials don't care what people like me think in the United States? And again, there's variation, but we're at a relative high point. And finally, the similar measure that the General Social Survey asks, which is just they've asked a big battery of confidence in American institutions. They ask, it's a 12-question battery, including political and non-political, Congress, presidency, courts, big business, labor, doctors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if I take an average of these institutions, there's a gradual decline. This is an average on a 0.5 to 1 scale, average across all institutions over time. Some institutions more than others. The decline in the press is the biggest, but there's a gradual decline in pretty much everything. So you look at this and you see, well, something might be going on, but all these. So the final one I'll say that's often cited is this measure of roll call voting in Congress. You get a lot of congressional scholars that their evaluation will be how polarized is Congress. Congress is more polarized than it used to be. This might be a measure of general polarization. So this is a chart I did not create, but I grabbed off T-Pool's website. This is just the roll call voting score, liberal and conservative, of the median Republican in Congress since the end of Reconstruction, and then Democrats, all Democrats, Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and you can just see that it's often said that in the mid-20th century, the median voting conservatism, liberal voting score was not too far apart, and as we've gone forward, they've gotten further and further apart. And Southern Democrats have gotten less and less distinct. There are fewer of them, and they are similar to other Democrats. Right? So this is also can be mentioned. The final thing I'll just say is that all these measures are indirect. Right? Oftentimes they were not primarily created for assessing whether the American democracy is stable or going to fall into authoritarianism. That's not how they are created, and thus the survey questions thus are sort of indirect and vague, for lack of a better term. Trust in government. What do they mean by government? What do we government officials? What do we mean by government officials? But this is what we have in a time series, and if we want to make better questions, we will not have them since 1958. So that is that is a weakness. So let's talk about then what we want to collect. That guides the transition nicely to what we want to collect.
So this is kind of what we're proposing. The first thing, very quickly, the first part of the proposal has to do with just making access to all this information easier. So we have sort of two proposals, one that's much simpler than the other. The first would be a portal, which would simply be a place where anyone who wants to get these comparative measures of democracy could go to this one-stop portal and sort of pick on, which would have links to info, descriptions of data sets, and just make it quickly be a portal. One thing I'm sort of curious about is if anyone has come across one of these before. This is sort of a little bit new to me, so maybe something like this is out there already, maybe some university's already done it, but that would be the sort of simplest thing you could do, which we think would have an immediate big payoff, right? So if you're trying to do this in your Lucan, you want to make this chart, you can do it with 10 different data sets, more sophisticated version of this, or the more involved version of this, would be to make a dashboard, which would not just link people to where the data was, but would have some basic functionality for interacting with that data and being able to do your own visualizations really quickly, single out if you want to compare the United States to Venezuela and Turkey and Russia and see what that looks like across 12 different data sets. You could do that quickly. Again, there's some of the there are trade-offs in terms of what would be the advantages and disadvantages of this, but this is our sort of first proposal of what could be done. We think that there's a lot of data out there already, right? And so giving people easier access to it might be one small step the Knight Foundation could do, and this seems like a couple ways it could do that. However, if we want to go a step further and make a contribution to it, it seems to us, and again, we're sort of particularly responding to the interest here in getting these more nuanced measures of what's going on in the United States. And from our review, as we said, there's been all this kind of effort in sort of coding the strength of democracy cross-nationally, but then almost everything we came across for measuring the strength of democracy comparatively within the United States are these kind of indirect sort of vague ways. So we have kind of three recommendations we are making about ways that one could start to think about collecting new data in this regard. And this is essentially, the first would be to take these cross-national methods, but bring them to more comparative study within the United States, which we'll explain in a second. The second would be new surveys, which John will talk about, sort of focused more on democracy. And the third, which is the sort of more ambitious, and we'll talk about it very briefly at the end, would be to try to harness new sources of data beyond what's been done previously. And we'll talk about social media for a second here. So the idea with the U.S., bringing the U.S. expert survey, to bringing the expert survey method to the study of democracy in the United States, is the idea that we have spent a lot of time over the previous decades developing developing sort of best practices, developing lots and lots of experience with trying to use expert-based analysis to measure democracy. As a result, by the way, we have lots of measures of the United States as a whole over that time period, although, as other people will say, they'll mostly be sort of these just flat lines, right? So the idea would be to try to go to the U.S. with this expert-based approach, but move beyond this one score per 1 year. And so the idea would be, how could we disaggregate? So the most obvious way is we could disaggregate by geography, try to come up with scores by states. That would be one way. But you could also think about disaggregating democracy in terms of different socio-demographic groups, right? Some of our talks about democracy about, like Lucan was saying, level playing field, access to information, voter rights, about voter suppression, these kinds of things, access to the ballot booth. It might be interesting to begin to think about disaggregating this in some more creative ways, like urban versus rural, or different ethnic groups in society, or racial groups in society, or young versus old. So there are some ways we can think about harnessing this expert survey method to give us more nuanced measures of what's going on in the United States. That would be one way we could do this. Now, the nice thing about this is that we can draw on the existing research that's been done previously to identify some best practices. And we go through this in the report in more detail. But clearly, there are advantages, we would say there are these sort of 4 guidelines if you wanted to take this method to providing more nuanced measures in the United States. One is delineation of analytical concepts, right? Any one of us, as already has happened in this conference, can sit down and say, well, this is some way someone defines democracy. This is the way somebody else defines democracy. VDEM is a really nice illustration of this, of how a massive effort was made to draw on existing theoretical literature about different concepts of democracy and designing measures that are explicitly linked to these different theoretical approaches. A second thing would be sort of clear, taking all the sort of open science methods, clear public instructions to coders, making known what everyone is being instructed, how they're doing it. Third would be to build on, to have multiple coders for whatever you're doing, and this is actually some of the challenges, right, if you're going to start doing this in 50 states. And then reporting intercoder reliability, and finally there are more sophisticated averaging methods to compute scores than just averaging or adding up, and there's all sorts of kind of interesting work that's been done in this regard. So if that was something that seemed interesting to people, to try to have more disaggregated measures of democracy in the United States. Oh, and of course, sorry, it was on the slide. The other way you can disaggregate is just more time to do this quarterly instead of doing 1 year per score. There are some best practices to draw on. The other idea is that we can actually go and start conducting new types of surveys.
Right. So very briefly, because we're short on time. So we can try to better, one thing, two ways to get surveys. We're going to try to better understand how we should interpret the still thinking about the question you just answered, I'd like you to tell me what came to mind as you were answering that question. Exactly what things went through your mind. And let people say anything they want. And then oftentimes you get more response. You can have as many other probes as you want. And I really love open-ended stop-and-think questions on national surveys. I love open-ended, but it's still national sample. It's not a focus group. It's just a bunch of strange people, right? It's a national representative survey. So I think it's a great way if you have a survey question that is asked a lot of places, but you have no idea what people think will be answered. And you have to start from scratch. Like, what do people mean? And it seems to move in predictable ways. The other thing we want to do is ask in the U.S. more explicit questions about support for democracy. So the main one is the World Values Survey has a battery that comes explicit support for democracy that Josh uses to great success in his book. Go outside again. That we'd like to ask more frequently with bigger sample sizes in the U.S. And ask a variety of questions. We'd be happy if the military ruled. We'd be happy if it's along these, can the president dissolve Congress? These sort of questions. We have very few actions for that. So be much more, as a better comparison, we should ask this more frequently and bigger sample sizes so we can get disaggregate by region.
Okay, and since we're basically out of time, I'm just going to say the other opportunity here would be to go in a new direction, right? To try to measure democracy in ways that kind of haven't been done before, going outside the mass-based survey and going outside the expert-based survey. And the sort of obvious place that one could start is social media, where you have hundreds of millions of Americans who are expressing their thoughts about politics. You have pretty much every elite member of U.S. politics expressing thoughts about politics. I've got a piece that's going to come out in a comparative democratization newsletter forum that goes into all of this in great detail. We're sort of out of time. I'm going to skip this. The basic takeaway is directly measuring democracy, replicating like a Freedom House score using social media seems like it's not impossible, but is extremely, extremely challenging. However, there might be some indirect measurements that are potentially interesting, such as using social media to pick up attitudes toward democracy or indicators of democracy, things like support for tolerance, which we have been doing with social media data. And you also could get into things like usage patterns that wouldn't rely on the text of social media, but things like, do you have looking for polarization by who's on different platforms, right? Do you have a situation where conservatives really all migrate to Gab, and Twitter is left to be, liberals, and Facebook is left to be, people over certain. So you can imagine something like that. This is really kind of more very preliminary and outside the box type stuff. But as I said, I have a whole piece on this for anyone who's interested. But I think the thing to close with here is that the sort of challenges and opportunities about thinking about social media, the challenges is even more so than what John's talking about asking a new survey question, which would be a complete departure from previous time series. You're talking about different measures, right? There's a ton of noise in the data when you're working with text and when you're working with social media data. So you have a massive sort of investment up front to get this stuff started, both in terms of thinking about how to do it, learning how to do it correctly, and getting people to accept that it's a valid way to think about this stuff. There are some opportunities, though, that are worth thinking about in this concept, right? Is that once you get the system going, it's potentially cheaper in the long run than these efforts that involve surveying and paying 2,500 people all over the world to provide feedback. The other thing is it may have fewer biases in it than humans. If you have machines essentially generating scores from some sort of objective measures that are out there, one of the problems we know with democracy scores is the inherent bias to sort of all the other things that can creep in. The other thing is that if what we're really interested in is detailed time series, right, something like social media, which can be updated with new data every day, is going to get you in a really different place than asking a bunch of experts once a year or even once every 4 months about something. And if what we're really concerned about with these measures, what we want to know now with these measures is the delta, the change, right? And we're not so concerned about the level, right? And we think that picking up on these changes earlier as opposed to later, things that are more equipped to catch these things in this sort of way may be useful. So anyway, that's a much longer story. We can talk more about that. Anyway, thanks very much.
At the latest.
So we have 26 minutes at the latest. Let's say 25. Okay, so I also have a task of trying to say something about all of this in whatever, 2 minutes, something like that. Well, first of all, thank you, and this was all extremely interesting, and inevitably I will look at all of this through the prism of what I'm thinking at the moment, trying to develop a project which is very much, I think, inspired by Cass's work. And my thinking is about the necessity of creating something that might be called varieties of populism. There is certain strong variants there, and they may have very different short and long-term impacts. And as someone coming from anthropology, predictably, I'm interested in culture, and what Belinda already mentioned, the significance of narratives. And so coming from this is how I can quickly comment on the few things that have been said. The concept of incremental backsliding is important and needs to be perhaps a little bit more unpacked. What I observe, and I'm looking mostly at Central Europe, is that you have the phenomenon which I called in recently delayed reaction or delayed transformational fatigue or something like that. And that there's something very, very important in that delay. This is not sort of automatic, it is constructed in a way. It is very much what was said in the first panel, which I like very much, about the significance of the supply side of politics. There is a supply not just of organizations and resources, but also the supply of specific narratives, of specific interpretations of the world that shows up late in the transition, later than perhaps some of us, certainly myself, expected. So that is an important element of the situation to study. So you have in this incremental backsliding political mechanisms, social, economic, that were mentioned, but there's something on the cultural side, on the side of kind of interpretations of a certain kind popping up at a certain moment, and it is not easy to understand why at this moment, although perhaps through more work one can figure it out. But I suspect this work would have to be done not only on the political side of things, but also on the what we call the cultural mobilization. Just think about the rise of evangelical movement in the United States, where quite clearly someone like Lee Atwater, if you remember the name, he talked about it. It was first the realization that there's a tremendous potential base, then cultural mobilization, and only then kind of political mobilization, and the use of it. I actually, the case that I study most closely, which is Poland, I actually see that. You have the rise of very powerful, what I call messianic right-wing populism in Poland, in the situation in the country that, by all accounts, was the success story of among the post-communist countries. And Lucan mentioned that is a very serious case and a very serious puzzle. Maybe it's an outlier, but there is some interesting, important lesson to be learned there. Cultural change often precedes institutional changes, and that is something that we need to capture better. What is then important in the emergence of this phenomenon we're all looking at is polarization. Again, I completely agree with Lucan, and it was mentioned already in other talks a few times. And the proper conceptualization and the measurement of this polarization, which is not just, again, an institutional and political polarization, but it's a very powerful cultural cleavage that emerges. It is a culture war in several countries already. And there are several tools one can use. I have no time to talk about it, but one area where I looked at is the difference between cultures of dignity. Remember, many revolutions around the world are in the name of dignity. So the culture of dignity has something to do with all of this, but the opposite of the cultures of dignity are cultures of honor. And in cultures of honor, the defense of the collective and the collective's good name becomes the principal objective. And many of those right-wing populists are clearly in those cultures of honor rather than cultures of dignity. Then the last talk, very important about measuring all of this and coming to terms with many issues that we have in those various databases that we use. Again, Josh mentioned at the beginning, and I know a bit of his work on what's happening on Twitter, what's happening in the social media, and I do think that this is extremely important to catch earlier those kind of changing cultural climates. And he, so I haven't seen this, what you mentioned, the level of hate speech that you guys looked at. I'm looking forward to looking at it and understanding how you do that. I think it is extremely important. If we agree that this interaction of the political and cultural can give us some additional purchase on understanding all of this. And two very quick things. It is interesting that the first panel gives us a very solid, great two representatives of the school of thinking that is deeply embedded in history and political science, done in a historical way with very careful attention to context and actual real-life evolution of this stuff, and paying attention to actual sequences, cultural, political, economic, and so on. And on the other hand, the approach that Josh represented, and that I think that, of course, we always talk about the necessity of talking to each other. I'm not sure if it's possible, really, but maybe there is something. I can talk to Josh. There is something that is still extremely exciting about trying to figure out how to combine, how to learn from each other, and so on. And the final thing, when you were talking about, John, about the open questions at the end, so I mean, that's, of course, someone coming from perhaps more qualitative than quantitative tradition, that's obvious, right, that one wants to do that and wants to understand how people understand those things we talk about. But I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Fred Schaefer on ordinary language interviewing. That is exactly what he tried to do. It is, of course, much more time-consuming, but you gather an enormous amount, as much as you can, of speech by letting people talk, and then you're trying to figure out what they mean exactly by those terms. So this has been done, and there are some very good beginnings. Of course, it could have been done on a bigger scale. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say, not to take too much time. Those are my kind of preliminary basic thoughts. I think it was really terrific. Now we have 17 minutes. Let's go.
Yeah, so I'll ask a couple of questions if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed this very much. I just wanted to hear a bit more involved in the second. You had three different scenarios. Scenario one is sort of the best scenario. Scenario three is like authoritarianism. So somehow scenario two didn't come out as clearly. What exactly scenario two was? So maybe talk a little bit about that. To Lucan, I just wanted to know, so what rise of polarization, I think this is critical, and I agree with it. I mean, I don't think I used that word, but that's sort of I wonder to what degree, I mean, the cases that I know, it seems to always be this asymmetric polarization. That's how it begins. One side, there's a kind of first mover in this process of polarization. Or does polarization just happen symmetrically? And I'm wondering in the cases that you look at for others as well, does it tend to be one side moves first, and this unleashes a kind of spiral? And then for Josh, I just am provoking you. So one thing, I mean, the idea of having daily indicators. I mean, I mean, this is incredibly powerful. I mean, if you could have a consensual understanding of what violations of democratic norms are, the idea that this could be checked against which you hold. I mean, the same way that we look at the stock market as a daily indicator of hourly indicator of how government performance or the state of the economy. The idea that we could have a daily check or hourly check of words that politicians use to hold people accountable. And that,
different institutions, which was remarkably stable. I mean, a 40-year period dropping about 0.1 doesn't really come together with some of the others. And I wonder, I mean, obviously that's you said 12 institutions, and so there are a couple that are incredibly stable. Right? And I assume that that's less, like the Army would be one of them, perhaps police or something. But that would be very interesting to tease out, because there's a fair chance that if there is a drop, which is perhaps much bigger, in actually much more political institutions than state institutions that are seen as at least not political partisan. I wonder whether you have looked at the electoral integrity project at the Norris. So that's kind of an expert survey, and they also include the U.S. and the states. But the one thing, I kind of miss the system. In your whole assessment, you're looking, it's a very democratic interpretation of democracy. Your violence is looking at what the people think, right? and whether that shifts. And I'm not sure whether the people are actually that important in the democratic backsliding. First of all, I think that we have a far too rosy view about how democracy used to work in the 50s, 60s, 70s, which are now the golden age. And I think it would be really good to go back to that period in light of what we're concerned about now. Right? And so one of the things that we talk about endlessly is about the so-called gap between the elite and the people. And that gap is way bigger in the 50s and in the 60s. Right? It was that the people didn't care because they didn't participate in the gap. And so I think part of this backsliding might be also simply a story of a rosy past. And so I think part of what we could do is actually do expert survey of previous periods, but not asking like 30 people to score them, but actually just read what happened in those periods and see how democracy worked in the U.S. And I'm sure it doesn't work, it didn't work in the way that we now think it did work.
Really, really interesting stuff. Two
questions. Could you please ask quick questions, maybe, because we are now 7 minutes from.
I have questions about the emphasis on polarization as an explanation. I'm not sure if it has to be at the elite level, the mass level, or what, because I haven't really heard the mechanism by which that is talking about, and it definitely doesn't fit in the American case. For example, the public sees Trump as more centrist than most Republican candidates have been in the past. So we don't have the sense that he's our far-right candidate. At least he doesn't exemplify that very well. But in addition, the whole explanation of talking about religious rights and so forth, religion is way down in the United States. There are more people who don't identify religiously now than there have ever been in our history. So I guess I want more of a, the first cause of what's going on other than just polarization at large. So I'm wondering what you have in mind as the mechanism.
So I just had a couple of thoughts on some of the presentation. So starting with Lucan's, I like the graphs that you had about disputing the idea that the decline of democracy, except that those were like countries, and if I'm not mistaken, the last time I saw the data, it's like 40% of the world's population lives under democracies or something. I mean, so would the graph? I mean, if you plotted the number of people rather than the number of countries, how would the shifts look over time? And I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me that would be another one. It's like, are we? Well, it's how full is the glass that we're starting with, that we're looking at the beginning? And then just two thoughts for Josh and John. So I love open-ended questions as well, but just remember that you ask those questions right now, and you'll find out what people are meaning when they say most people are crooks or something. What they're thinking now, but that doesn't mean that that's what they were thinking.
Yeah.
So again, if we do this for the next 40 years, that's great. We'll have the records, but that's not going to help us better understand the trends over time. And then with the social media, so I kind of pay attention to this, but it's like my experience stops with email, and my children have prohibited me from getting on any other sort of social media. But I fear, you were throwing out the advantage of this, that it's unbiased and things, and so, if we had daily records of this would be great, but what is social media changes all the time, right? Not too long ago, it was like all Facebook, and then Twitter came along, and then all these different, and so what it is that people are using, and then the big fear that I have, or the big unknown about this, is how these computer algorithms are distorting or shaping the data, because it's who you get exposed to that you can connect to and things like this. And so, a lot of these things people don't know, or they're not public, what the algorithms are and things. And so it's like a fascinating problem, but a huge problem also.
Okay, I will now ask to answer as much as.
Two grad students.
Okay, well, I have to get the permission from the boss.
Were there more hands up?
Yeah,
There are quite a few. This is
two grads.
Why don't you just take a couple quick questions, but then people will reserve the right. We won't be able to answer every question, but let's get them out there, and then you can continue talking. But
Okay.
let's throw out a couple, and then you can try to answer.
Okay,
what you
so
can.
let's.
Okay, so my question was about the satisfaction as a measure for democracy, for the health of democracy. And I wonder, thinking about other questions you might answer that, whether this is also a case, kind of what Casper said, was about how our expectations are changing. In the same way we expect our standard of living to constantly be increasing, so we might be dissatisfied just with stability, whether what people think democracy should involve changes, and whether there's a way to ask a question about which of these things we think are important for
just to cast very quickly, just as a point of information, I suppose, just happened that on the plane, this is things when something does on the plane, I've read Jacques Rancier's Hatred of Democracy. And this is exactly, the half of the book is about the rosy picture and how wrong it is. So that's something useful to look at. And Daniel's point about asymmetric polarization, I think is tremendously important. It's like looking at your kids, and your big question as a parent always, who started it, right? And I think this is really hugely important, but I will not take more time. So please, maybe Bob, you start.
Yes. Well, let me. There was one question addressed directly to me. It was Dan's about what chaos scenario would look like. I didn't write it with the first weeks of the Trump administration in mind, but I think it illustrates what I'm talking about. I mean, what you're seeing, at least so far, is really no coherent direction. Lots of ad hoc initiatives, transactional relationships, partial coalitions, all sort of surrounded by a lot of infighting, both within the administration and between the administration and the cabinet, and between the administration and the Congress. I don't see that as something that's going to end up with Trump concentrating authority. On the contrary, but I do see it as a process which can lead to repeated constitutional crises and stalemate. That's why I think that, and what I try to do in each of those scenarios was speculate about how this is going to end. And that scenario, it seems to me, the odds of an impeachment or a resignation go up. So one other question on, one other comment wasn't directed to me, but I think it's really an important point, and that is that if you're going to make comparisons between Trump and other moments of illiberalism, the United States had plenty of those. And, you know, I was struggling with cross-sectional comparisons between countries I know, but none of those are very satisfactory because there's too much apples to oranges kind of problem. What's more of an apples to apples comparison is the United States today versus the United States, say, in the 1950s, or the United States following the end of World War or during World War I, and you know, where you had serious illiberal moments. And I haven't really thought carefully about that, but it does seem to me that we oughtn't to assume that American democracy is, you know, has always been democratic, or at least has always been liberal, and it might be instructive to kind of compare those kinds of crises.
Great, wonderful questions. First of all, Dan, I think that's great. You know, asymmetric person, right? I guess I actually did a list of comparing them, which I won't give you now. But I think, you know, definitely if it's, you know, bipolar as opposed to asymmetric or symmetric polarization, is definitely much worse. It's definitely much worse to be Germany than to be the U.S. That's one way of thinking about it. But I think that's
Germany started on one side.
It started on one side, but by the 30s, it was definitely, you know, and so, but you know, a lot of it probably has to do with geopolitics, you know, whatever. But I think that's a really interesting, fascinating question. David, I think absolutely the game is not up. It's still a question mark is there, and I still actually think the most important. It is still primarily a question of resilience of democracy, and I think that is still, you know, I mean, Larry was very happy that I went over. Larry Diamond was very happy that I went over to his side. I'm like, hey, dude, just, you know, I'm just interested in your side. Doesn't mean I'm gonna full scale democratic backslide. U.S. We have I have the pleasure of co-authoring with Rob Mickey and Steve Levitsky and I have a piece coming out in Foreign Affairs which addresses this question, largely because Rob knows stuff I don't know stuff. And basically, I sort of see the U.S. politics in crude terms as a two-layer cake. You know, the elite is very kind of ideologically polarized, and the the substance of the cake is much more kind of negative partisanship driven by race. You know, doesn't care about taxes. But it, you know, it still has the negative partisanship. Still has a lot of qualities of polarization. I think we'd still call it that. Population, yes. The problem is that, you know, in one version of a paper I'm writing, I had Tonga as an example of democratic success. 100,000. Do we really care about Tonga? Has anybody heard of Tonga? Raise your hand. This is clearly experts that know Tonga. Well, 100,000. Who cares?
They do.
They do. Sorry. That's really bad. The Trump effect. I think, you know, it's generally agreed that the fourth wave of democracy was caused by unipolarity, of the fact that, you know, you had a liberal hegemony. When that liberal hegemon is no longer liberal, you know, that is a problem. And I think we actually see direct connection here already. I was just talking to the Hungarian consul. You know, the whole thing around the CEU was in large part driven by the fact that Viktor Orban figured, hey, Trump hates Soros, I hate Soros, I'm going to attack Soros, you know, as a way of getting closer to Trump. And so that's about as a direct connection as you get. You know, and so I think some other cases less obvious, like Venezuela. I don't know, but I do think that having the kind of suddenly you have an illiberal hegemon, you know, suddenly the sort of notions of what's permissible changes quite radically. I think that can have a huge effect on democracy.
I'll just say really quickly, thank you all for the comments. They're extremely helpful. Just in the interest of brevity, I'll just speak very quickly on the social media thing. You know, I mean, that's not the main focus of the report. It's much more speculative in this regard. I do think it's very hard to do some of these things and coming up with scores. That being said, I think it's really important that we realize, and one thing we've learned in doing this review is that, you know, starting with David's point, like, can you really get at this with data? Like, everybody wants a number. So everybody wants a number. So either you're going to have a lousy number or you're going to have better numbers, right? Like, we're not going to go back to a world where everyone's just going to read a lot and when they're doing this stuff and really learn the histories and get the good patterns. They want a number that they can put on a chart. So, and there are problems with all of these numbers, right? That's what we've learned. There are problems with expert surveys. And I can't tell you how many expert surveys I've been asked to fill out about things that I know nothing about, right? Like, I do not know what the quality of democracy at polling stations in New York City were on election day. I know there was a long line at my polling station, right? I came back to it later, it was a little shorter. That's it. Why am I an expert for that survey, right? I do not know a lot of things about Belarus. I've been asked to fill out expert surveys on Belarus, right? That's it. So, I mean, there are problems with expert surveys. There are problems with merging expert surveys. There are stunningly huge problems with correlations across expert surveys, which is strange because I think my suspicion is the same experts are filling out different expert surveys. In fact, I know from hanging out with Radek Markovsky at Ispen Pond and look at the stack of 5 different expert surveys on his desk, because he gets asked to fill out all of them, why they should not be correlated with each other. I thought the problem was they were going to be too correlated, but the Unified Democracy Scores finds that it's really easy to find 2 surveys that gives 2 countries all sorts of different rankings, right? The U.S. measures of this, as lots of people have pointed out here, are vague. They weren't intended to get at democracy. So social media, yeah, there are all sorts of things about social media that are non-representative. Anything you do with social media, it's got to start from that premise. On the other hand, there's so many people on social media that it may actually be an important early warning signal about democracy if suddenly, even if you only have 15% of your population using Twitter, that percentage of the population is using much more violent imagery and language in their discussions of politics than they were 6 months previously. Those might actually be important indicators. And the final thing I'll just say is I love Dan's point, because the one place where there's no problem on social media with whether it's representative or not is politicians. Right? You could clearly monitor, and I never thought of this before, the extent to which members of the U.S. Congress are violating democratic norms in their speech, and you could do it across press releases, Twitter, Facebook. It would be very easy to do once you did the hard work of what it meant to violate that. So there's all sorts of outside-the-box stuff here, and I just think, and surveys, the other thing about surveys is, right, like, you know, we are living, we have to, as a field, and I work with survey data all the time, but we have to, as a field, recognize we're entering crisis era with surveys, with response rates. And so the idea that that social media is not representative and we have to do fixes with the data to sort of modify it, but representative sample surveys of people who are willing to answer their phone after dinner and tell you an answer that you could even find their phone number in the first place are not being ex post manipulated to try to make them representative is no longer the case. So I think, all these things are flawed. People want numbers. And so we're just trying to think, and within that context, this is an interesting opportunity because we have a foundation that thinks it's important for its own sake as a foundation to get some better data, possibly. So if you have ideas, please do let us know.
And two very quick points. In response to Rick's question, I couldn't agree more that open-ended we ask now wouldn't necessarily be representative of what we get in open-ended memory dump across when these questions were first asked in 1958. And I think I just need to be humble about how we describe what, because I think that's all we can do. Right? I don't know. So what's the best we can do to make these time comparisons meaningful without a time machine? So how do I get more meaning out of this time series than I did before? So yes, you're completely right. And then and there's something to think about. What we're going to get is suggestive, and it indicates where we are now. And then with the combination of where we are now and the time series will be suggestive, but we shouldn't overclaim about what people were thinking in the past. And then the question of, are these time series ambiguous and noisy? Yes. So I'm not here to make a case for them as particularly telling a clear story. I mean, because the foundation just asked us, find every measure you could get and see what they could verify our impressions that things are getting worse. And the answer is it's a little ambiguous. I mean, like these questions on the NES and the GSS that ask things directly, the end is worse than the beginning of the time series, but there is a lot of noise. Some things it makes sense. Like there's big movement after 9/11. There's some movement after Watergate. Some don't. And the confidence battery, I could have done it. We were already way over time. I could have done it, but there is what's called in the field confidence displacement going on here, where confidence is going down in some institutions and staying steady or going slightly up. So confidence has gone down the most in the press, the president, Congress, and Congress stayed steady in, gone down in business and labor, stayed roughly steady in medicine and other professions, and roughly gone up in the military. So that produces not much decline in this, but we can do a whole presentation about how worried we should be about that confidence displacement. But that's definitely happening.
Okay, thank you. Can I say one thing about polarization? Final one thing, like one sentence, maybe two. The problem is, I think, relatively well diagnosed that the polarization happens particularly at the elite level, and it doesn't translate to what we know about the distribution of attitudes in the population. But think about what polarization does to other sort of features of the population. Population gets annoyed. You have the pervasive sense of malaise, of something is going wrong, so they do not need to get polarized themselves in order to be terribly alienated by the elite politics that's polarized. This is a bit of a hypothesis, but I sense it very strongly in Central Europe. This is what's happening. This unexpected, in a way, polarization of the elite has those kind of consequences that do not necessarily are limited to the question whether the population is also polarized. All right, so that's it. Welcome.